The Bob Murphy Show, episode 359. Hey, everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. We've got yet another crossover. Adam Heyman returns. This time, we're talking about tariffs versus income taxes. And all this, of course, is in the context of the Trump victory. And I really don't think I need to sell it much more than that. That's what we talk about. And I promise you, as always, if you're interested in this topic, Adam and I take it to a deeper level than I think you're going to get just about anywhere else. So we cover all the standard stuff, but then we take it one or two steps more. Let me also mention, it just so happened with my travel schedule and whatnot that I have two back-to-back crossovers, but I do have plenty of other episodes, interviews lined up, as well as solo episodes. So that stuff will be coming shortly. Thank you for your patience. And without further ado, let's go to my discussion with Adam on tariffs.
Heyman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Heyman.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam. How's it going?
I am very, very good. You hear something about this Donnie G. Trump? You heard about him?
I think so. Did he win some kind of popularity contest?
Something, spelling bee, I don't know. Anyway, Mr. Trump, he's been saying some amazing things about tariffs, and since you are a bona fide economist, I thought we might talk about that. He said that, hey, and it might be a great idea. Everyone hates the IRS. Let's just abandon that and replace that income stream with tariffs. And then he went on with Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan Experience, and Joe asked him point blank about that question. And old Slick Donnie, he sort of bobbed and weaved, but I mean, he didn't just run away from the idea. So, So what do you think about all that?
Sure. I don't know if this is true, but I had heard from someone who's like closer to Trump than I am. That guy thought that what happened in that exchange was that Trump hadn't been briefed with numbers and stuff from people so he was. Because I don't know if you caught it, but Dave Smith lamented that exchange and said that there was a great chance for Trump just to really sell the people on imagine no IRS and you just get to keep what you earn. And instead, he pivoted to American history and how great tariffs were, And
right.
So, but my point is what the guy who was telling me he thought would happen in that exchange was that Trump wasn't armed with facts about we could, which to me sounded funny because that stopped Trump elsewhere.
No, why would that slow him down?
So it's anyway, they'd be like, he was afraid of saying something that was exaggerated. But anyway, so I thought it would be good just to go through some bullet points here real quick, folks. And then, Adam, as is his wont, will kick the tires and so forth. But yeah, just in big picture, let's just say, what would it look like in terms of standard economics? So this isn't even like Austrian school stuff per se. This is kind of just standard public finance economics, as far as what's the difference between a sales tax versus an income tax. And so in general, economists think that taxing consumption is more efficient than taxing income. And when we say things like that, we mean for a given amount of revenue. Obviously, taxing consumption by $60 trillion is worse than taxing income by $2, that kind of stuff. But to raise a given amount of revenue, other things equal, economists typically think taxing consumption is better than income. And it just has to do with the number of distortions it introduces. So if you tax consumption, it's kind of like treating consumption today the same as consumption next year. It's just the same rate. Whereas if you're taxing income, in a sense, it's like taxing future consumption at a higher rate. Because you could, you earn your income, you pay the tax right now, you can consume it now, that's fine. But if you want to consume it next year, then you'd let it roll over and earn interest, and then that interest income gets taxed again. So it's like artificially making the savings, less lucrative than it otherwise should be, right? So that's kind of the intuition.
Is that a standard sort of definition for when an economist says one thing is more efficient than another, that it causes less distortions or interferes with, the productivity of a nation in worse ways or something like that?
I mean, certainly if you're talking about taxes, yes. In general, the idea is that there are gains from trade or more general just economic activity And if the tax code causes people to refrain from mutually advantageous activities, then that's considered a distortion.
Yeah.
So it's not like the money flowing to Washington is the problem, because in theory they could do something with it, including like mailing everybody rebate checks, right? So it's not so much the flow of the money, it's more that people would have done one thing, and that in general trade, if it's voluntary, makes both parties better off. And so like if there's a big looming tax, I guess that's the way to make the point. If they impose a really punitive tax on people who were going to trade, one guy was going to trade his apple, the other guy was going to give him the orange, and they're both going to walk away with the thing that they thought was better. And then the government comes along and says, no, for every fruit exchange, you owe us 50%. And so the guys just don't trade. The government didn't raise any revenue, and yet now that potential mutually beneficial trade didn't happen. So the world is worse off in that sense, and there's not even revenue. So that's kind of a good way of showing it's not the payment of money to Washington per se that economists usually have in mind when they talk about it's sometimes called a deadweight loss of taxation. So on that score, yes, that other things equal, there's gains. If you're willing to defer consumption, you can get more down the road. That's right. Comes in the form of interest. Like that's how a household reckons that. And so if the government's taxing income, it distorts that trade-off over time. And so that's why that's considered worse than a consumption tax. It's like a consumption tax on top of then also penalizing savings, if that's one way we want to think about it. Okay, so there's that element. So on that score, you could say, a tariff is like a tax on sales, let's say, not income directly. So on that narrow criteria, you'd say, point tariff, in terms of if a tariff could replace the income tax. But the other side is it's also a standard criterion in terms of like tax analysis to say typically what you want to do to raise a target amount of revenue, you want to have as wide a base as possible so the rate can be as low as possible to raise that revenue, because the higher the tax rate, the more you're distorting that activity, right? The more you're making people just not engage in the first place, and you can get into a downward spiral where, to raise the amount of revenue, if the original tax you did then causes the activity to shrink, you got to make the rate higher to raise the target revenue. You know what I mean? You can get in this thing where you ended up having a really punitive rate. And that's applicable in this context because the relevant base, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but in terms of like how much internet, how many imports are there right now to tax? Like what percentage would you levy on it versus how much domestic income is earned every year, right? So to put it the other way, to raise the same amount of revenue right now that the income tax raises, the tariff rates would have to be high. And in fact, they'd be so high that people would stop importing, right? And then it wouldn't even work, if you get what I'm saying. So a proponent could say, yeah, exactly. So if we totally jettison the IRS and just try to do it with tariffs, they couldn't possibly raise as much revenue. And so that would force, Washington to cut back and whatever. And so if that's the idea, okay, great. But the numbers are so off that to me, that seems unrealistic. And I think what you're going to get in practice is a huge hike in tariffs and then maybe an income tax rate reduction, but certainly you're not going to get rid of the income tax. And then that goes in the last point I wanted to make was just a huge benefit. So back in the day, before the federal income tax, when the federal government raised its revenue primarily through the tariffs, they had other stuff like fees and whatnot. That was great. And then the introduction of the federal income tax, I think, was horrible, not just for the economic reasons, but because it gave Washington the ability to pry into all your business, right? Like to pay an income tax, they have to know what your income is. And so everybody's got to keep track of it. Whereas administratively, it's not as easy as it first sounds, because there's all kinds of like, where was this product made? And then what if there was, reimportation? It gets really complicated in practice, but conceptually, just to like have agents at the border, at the ports, slapping stickers on things when you pay the fee, that's a lot simpler, and you don't need to get into the business of Americans and what their financial transactions are. But again, that kind of goes back to what I said before. The only way you get that benefit is if you truly get rid of the income tax. If it's just like, let's raise tariffs, whatever, $300 billion and do a dollar for dollar income tax cut, you're still going to have all the privacy invasion, and people are going to be keeping track of the 1099s and blah, blah, blah. And so that's kind of what I'm worried about, that I think a lot of America First right winger types are really excited about this. And when you start doing Econ 201 about, well, tariffs are bad, and they go, no, but we're getting rid of the income tax, you idiot. And it's like, that'd be awesome, but I don't think that's going to happen.
I agree. Rhetorically, one of my favorite couple of points against the income tax, arguing against it, is to say, yeah, what a great idea. We make productivity, earning a living, a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And then the penalty is this fee that you have to pay. Oh, and by the way, you have to violate, your Fifth Amendment rights and testify against yourself every year in order to pay this fee. And my read of Trump on Rogan when he did the weave to kind of dodge that question is somebody got in his ear about what a great idea it was, like maybe a guy like Vivek or something. And then later, this is all in my imagination, of course, I assume somebody more wonky said, yeah, we can't ever do that, So if somebody ever asks you about that, maybe just play up how great tariffs are and just sort of ignore that other part, because we can't do that.
Yeah. And you just reminded me, the other thing that really bothers me about the way the typical MAGA person is handling this, is it MAGA or it's MAGA? Yeah. Is it's kind of like Kamala.
Changes every season.
Yeah. Is they, and I'm not attacking a straw man here. So folks, I'll link to, I recently went through Vivek and Charlie Kirk were doing some event at some university in Georgia where they, had the students come up, they had a mic set up and doing rapid fire stuff, kind of like Stump the Chump. And one kid came up and said, oh yeah, I like the Austrian school, and was asking about tariffs. And neither Vivek nor Charlie Kirk said, oh yeah, don't get us wrong, tariffs really are stupid, just like Bastiat taught, but we got to raise revenue somehow, and income taxes are even worse. They didn't say that at all. They were talking about how good tariffs were. And they got into some subtleties that maybe we'll probably get into, Adam, about national defense and stuff like that. But that's what I mean. It's some more sophisticated, nuanced Trump fans keep lecturing me on Twitter whenever this stuff comes up, saying, no, Bob, it's nobody's saying tariffs are good. They're just saying if you replace the income tax with, and yeah, I agree with that, but I don't agree with this, Bob, nobody's saying that. Even somebody as eloquent and deep thinker as Vivek didn't even mention that. It wasn't even like point number 3, as far as I can remember in the clip that they had on that thing. It was all about tariffs per se are good, at least under certain circumstances.
Yeah, national defense and nascent industries and a couple other things are on my list here. But I want to start with what do you think about Trump's rhetoric and, in part, his actions? What do you think about his tactic, which is using the threat of a tariff as a negotiating ploy or something? Do you think that has any merit at all?
It could. So just to give more for the listeners who are not sure what you mean. So I have seen some people defend the strategy, and this was back even when Trump was in office, of them saying like, oh yeah, Trump is not, he knows free trade is good, but right now there's lots of countries that aren't reciprocating. And so instead of us just being suckers and just saying, well, okay, well, we're going to do the right thing and turn the other cheek, that what Trump is doing is saying to them, you better lower your tariff rates and start behaving like a civilized trading partner, or else we're going to do it to you. And that if that can get them to back down with the threat of tariffs, and that's good. But the point is, it has to be a credible threat. If everybody knows Trump wouldn't really do it because, he needs to get permission from Bob Murphy or something to jack up tariffs, then it wouldn't happen. And so, so on that narrow point, okay, if that's the argument, fair enough. And if you want to just do a sort of expected cost benefit and say, every once in a while we got to actually pull the trigger to show we're not bluffing, but maybe in the long run that leads to lower tariff rates all around. Okay, that's fine. We can have that argument, but I think that gets lumped in with like one of 5 arguments in favor of why tariffs are so awesome.
Right.
And so like my analogy I use is to say, it's possible that you could go into a bank and go up to the teller and show, look I strapped myself with dynamite, and you could walk out of there with $100,000, but don't think blowing yourself up with dynamite is the way to boost your productivity, right? Like you really need to understand how that worked. And it's only because they didn't call your bluff that if you actually did blow yourself up, you're not helping yourself. And likewise, with the tariff case, if they call his bluff and then he raises tariffs, that makes Americans poorer on average.
Reminds me of that old Warner Brothers cartoon with Daffy Duck. He's having a hard time with his vaudeville act. He's not getting a reaction from the crowd, so finally he pulls out his biggest thing. He blows himself up with dynamite, and the crowd goes wild. And as he's floating up to heaven, Bugs is like, "Yeah, that was great." It's like, "Yeah, it's a great trick, but I can only do it once."
Those shows were a bit violent.
They were very violent. A lot of anvils. So I got a couple of questions, and
And that Acme company was so versatile.
I mean, they're the only company as far as I remember.
I guess they had the monopoly. Yeah.
I got a couple of questions, and they're closely enough related. I want to lump them together. A lot of times, we'll just talk about lazily a tariff on imported steel or something like that, which helps the Rust Belt and helps an industry in decline or something. But then we ignore all the knock-on effects, all the domestic companies that make products that rely on steel, and if those input factors get raised, there's all these knock-on effects. So I want to talk about those unseen consequences a little bit, and then the overarching question is who really pays a tariff, because a lot of people get confused about that.
Okay. Was that the question, or you
That's
you were
question.
warming me up? Okay.
Nope, that's it. Just that big punch in the face. Who pays it?
Okay. Yeah. So as far as the typical thing, right? I think sometimes there's a tendency to make it simple, a neat little, raising a tariff helps domestic producers but hurts domestic consumers, and it's a trade-off. And even though that's true, and I would be happy to argue with it just on those grounds alone, like if you were just importing, Game Boys or something, I don't even know what do the kids play with these days. I don't even know, what I mean? Some finished consumer good that's not an input into some other business.
Yeah.
But yeah, even if we're just that, and it really is just U.S. producers could be making this finished consumer good, or we import it, in the end of story, and it's just a matter of domestic producers versus domestic consumers. You could still go through it and make the case and just show that, the tariffs make the Americans poorer on average. Yeah. But yes, once you broaden it and you're talking about things like steel and whatever, and things that are, semiconductors is the one that Vivek brought up. I guess we'll get in a minute to the national security issue. Stuff that is, or inputs to other U.S. businesses, then it's not simply U.S. workers versus U.S. consumers. It's some U.S. workers versus every other U.S. worker and all the consumers. And so again, specifically that like you're saying steel or semiconductors, whatever it is, if the tariff is making it more expensive, then that hurts all the U.S. businesses that use that as an input. And so it's not clear how you're helping U.S. workers by eliminating the competition, for some of them, but then making the inputs more expensive for the rest of the businesses that employ the rest of the workers. So there's that element. Do you want to keep going on that, or do you want me to go into who pays it?
Quick follow-up on that. What would you do if some smarty pants says, well, yeah, but we've got computers now. We'll just follow and see what industries are impacted by the high steel prices, and we'll just raise tariffs on those products too. Easy peasy. One size tool fits all.
But if by construction we're talking about U.S. business, like steel's coming in, and there are some U.S. firms that use steel as an input, maybe that's the only thing that they import, right? And they sell to American consumers. So
only
there's no way to raise a tariff to help them, right?
Yep, fair enough. I was just wondering what you'd say to somebody like that. Yeah, so the who pays then?
Okay, so the who pays. What's interesting here is both sides are quite confident, and they're either both right or both wrong, right? So it depends what you mean when you say paying a tariff. But my point is to allow for the nuance of the real world, they're either both right or both wrong typically, and yet they're both confident that the other side's a bunch of morons. So, you could just talk about the actual who pays it, and there I actually don't know, and it may depend on the specifics of how the thing is actually levied. I don't know that if it's the same across the world, but it's like if there's an importer in the U.S., like at the port, and some foreign company sends them something, and then the deal is like, if at that point is a tax collected and then it gets sent into the U.S. The real issue is, as far as economists are concerned, is the actual impact of the tariff, right? So for economists, it doesn't really matter which side technically pays the money. Let me switch examples just to because I think it's easier to walk through the logic and then do it with the tariff. So, like, let's say there's going to be, how much is a pack of cigarettes nowadays? I don't even know.
I haven't the slightest idea.
Is it like $5?
Oh, way more than that.
10? Let's just say it's 10.
Sure, let's say it's 10.
Okay. So everyone, Adam and I, our bodies are temples, and that's why we have no idea. And so we're like the pretty girl at the bar. We don't pay for drinks or cigarettes. People just, okay. So let's say a pack of cigarettes with no tax is $10, and the government's going to levy a $1 tax on it, per pack. Okay. And so you could say, oh, well, to know the impact, are they levying it on the seller or the buyer? And so if they levy it on the seller, then that means like the consumer just, pays whatever the sticker price is to the cashier. And then the cashier, when they're getting ready to send the money back to like the tobacco company, they take the government's cut first, send it to Washington and then send the balance to the company. Or the other way is if it's levied on the consumer, there's like, the sticker price, the consumer pays that to the cashier who sends that to the company. And then the cashier takes another dollar from the consumer and sends that to Washington, right? And so people might think, without knowing economics, those two models of how the tax is collected makes a big difference, but actually it turns out to be the same because the price adjusts but there's another complication. I know this is getting complicated, but the problem is what really matters is it's what's called the elasticity.
Right.
And so the idea is like what part of the market can like get away from it the easiest. So generally we think people who are buying cigarettes are price insensitive, that even if it gets more expensive, they're probably not going to cut back too much. And so let's say like of that dollar, like 90 cents, the consumer pays. And so I think I can do this on the fly. And so the idea is if the government actually levies the tax on the consumer, what happens is the price of cigarettes drops to, what I say, $10 a pack was the original?
Mm-hmm.
Drops to $9.90, and then the consumer pays an extra dollar, right? And so the consumer like paid 90 cents more out of pocket for the pack. But the $1 went to Washington, and then the $9.90 went to the seller. So that's the sense in which the seller normally would have gotten $10 for it, but now only gets $9.90. So in a sense, paid 10 cents, even though they didn't send any money to Washington, right? It was just the actual sticker price fell to $9.90. And so that's the sense in which the consumer paid 90 cents of it and the producers paid 10 cents. But what's driving that result is not who it was levied on. It was the assumed elasticity issue, and that, oh yeah, smokers are really, you could jack up the price and they're not going to cut back too much. Because if you did it the other way, with assuming the same, addiction to smoking and everything, if you made the seller pay it, what happens is the sticker price rises to $10.90. So the consumer pays $10.90 to the cashier because they saw the sticker. That's what they thought the price was. And then the cashier takes $1 out of that and sends it to Washington and sends the balance of $9.90 to the seller. So even in that scenario too, the seller still gets $9.90 per pack and the consumer still paid $10.90 per pack. And that's how it works, right? So either way, whether it's formally levied on the consumer or formally levied on the producer, prices adjust, pre-tax prices adjust so that the actual burden is shared the way the elasticities demand. So when it comes to international trade, it's a similar thing. It's incidental whether the foreign company actually sends the money to Washington and then gets the full amount from the U.S. buyer, or whether the U.S. buyer gets hit with it, because the price that's charged to the final U.S. buyer adjusts to make it work out the way it would have in either case. And so what ultimately drives it's typically they both pay more, right? Like the U.S. consumer pays more for the product, and the foreign producer gets less. And Washington's the one getting, in the middle there, getting the cut. But it doesn't really matter who it's levied on. And so, like I said, both sides, when the anti-tariff people say, "Oh yeah, we pay for it," meaning consumers, they're partly right and partly wrong. And when the pro-tariff people say, "No, it's the Chinese who pay for it," again, they're because the real answer is they both do.
Yeah, perfect. And going back to your detailed cigarette analogy or model, knowing what we know about substitution effects, given that dollar tariff you just added to cigarettes, what percentage, and please work it out to 3 decimal places if you can, what percentage increase would we see in the black market crack cocaine market?
Right. So partly what 10.378, of course, percent. In case people don't get wired, you're like, what are these guys really extra giddy today? It's the last crossover. I alluded to the fact that I testified with Brad Sherman, and on the Bob Murphy Show version, folks, I did put the link and I found it where I was in congressional testimony, and Sherman asked the panel if what was it, global production went up 1%, how much would prices change or something like that? And I said 10.378% because I thought it was a silly question. Okay, so
my favorite moment of that was you leaned in and you gave the answer, then you sat right back. Like, nailed it.
Yeah. Wow, I'm good. Be like Ralphie. Oh, that was great. Okay, so yes. So there, I kind of just yada over the important part was the determination of elasticities. I kind of just asserted, let's say the consumer pays 90%, the producer pays 10%. And the reason I did that is because that's plausible, because cigarettes are considered to be a pretty inelastic, which is why, by the way, governments like taxing cigarettes.
Yep.
Because they can raise a lot of revenue. Whereas if you put it this way, if you just taxed Fruit Loops, you wouldn't raise much revenue because people would just buy other cereal. But if you tax breakfast cereal, you know what I mean? You would have as much. So the ability to substitute away, like you say, matters. And so that's why, again, the broader the base, the better it is, because the more narrowly. So, if Trump just did a huge tariff on semiconductors from China, they probably wouldn't raise too much revenue because China would just sell it to somebody else, and then they would sell it to the U.S. and you wouldn't get taxed. So, but if it's just, a tax on semiconductors in general, well, maybe not, because then somebody would just open up a domestic plant. But if it was just a tax on all imports, well, then probably that wouldn't actually distort too much, because you can't produce everything domestically, so you might as well just pay the tariff, right? And so that's how that stuff sorts itself out. And so with some things like, I don't know that I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it wouldn't surprise me if a tariff on produce from Mexico. I think the U.S. is probably a pretty big buyer there, and so the Mexican farmers don't have as many options. Like, they really want to sell into the U.S., so I would imagine there a tariff. The Mexican farmers would eat that more than U.S. consumers, as opposed to some particular electronic item from China that they can sell anywhere in the world. And to them, it doesn't really, whether they ship it to us across because that's the thing too, the Mexicans are right there. So it's not hard to ship, especially like fresh produce that they don't want to. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just saying there's differences, and it probably depends which particular good you mean, what the elasticities are.
Right.
So it's kind of hard, but that's what I'm saying. When people say who pays a tariff, that's like saying, do you like movies or not? It's like, well, that's kind of a big question. It depends how specific you want to get.
I don't want to go too far away from our core concept here, but I'm curious. Price elasticity is a real useful concept, obviously. Has anybody ever successfully managed to measure it in any meaningful way in any particular industry or good or anything?
Oh, yeah. I mean, with all this stuff, there's always caveats or whatever. But yeah, they do a lot of stuff, particularly things like gasoline. Because those prices fluctuate a lot, and so they do have a good idea of, at least for certain times of the year, to say, oh, other things equal, if the price of gasoline rises by such and such, this is what happens to the amount of fuel purchased. So
I
yeah,
was thinking maybe like building materials or something like that would be ripe for that because it'd be fairly constant. At what price you'd switch away from one thing to another thing, or I don't know. It seemed like it would either be something like that, or maybe it's just a fool's errand or something.
right. I mean, sure, certainly an individual company has to make those decisions.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? So
Yeah.
even if it hasn't nothing to do with tariffs, but just in general, prices are fluctuating all over the place, and like Hayek's famous example in was the use of knowledge in society. In one of his knowledge papers, I think it was the use of knowledge in society, where he's talking about the price system is like a communication mechanism, and he's saying like if a tin mine collapses somewhere, that sends a signal out that we got to economize on tin, and so
Yep.
all the operations that had been using tin the day before now realize, oh, to the extent possible, we should and so the ones that can use something else will, but the ones that no, we really need to use tin, they're just going to keep using it, and that's kind of what needs to happen
Do you want to
physically.
happen? Yeah.
Yeah. So,
All right. On the way to the critical national security industries, I'd rather start with, since I was in high school, I've heard the argument that basically the United States wouldn't ever even have had an industrial sectors if we hadn't started off with protective tariffs. Like for nascent industries, they're just essential, or you'll never get off the ground. You'll be outcompeted by Europe, which has been doing it for 50 years longer or something. What do we say to arguments like that?
well, what's interesting is, let's jump ahead to the present day. Right now, the reason we ostensibly need protective tariffs is because otherwise, well, our industry can't possibly compete with, factories put up in Bangladesh. So clearly we need to, that's crazy. We got to have a tariff. So how come back in the day, when America was new, and then how come the British weren't like, well, we need to have protective because otherwise all the manufacturing is going to go over to the Americans. We can't compete with the colonists or these new people who just beat us with their stupid guerrilla warfare and whatnot. Right. Right. So you see how, like, no matter whether you're an infant or 60 years old, you always need protection from these wily foreigners, because otherwise how could we compete?
Well,
And
on
so
that
it's
one
interesting.
particular example, you might see somebody who's crafty say, well, yeah, but it's far easier to not only move capital, but capital equipment now than you could back then. So it's not really apples to apples.
I mean, that is true, but I think when people are lamenting and saying we can't possibly compete with sweatshops set up in India or Bangladesh, it's not because U.S. capitalists provided them with those materials. Like, I think they're saying, no, they just built it. The argument there seems to be because their workers get paid so little.
Right.
And so I'm saying, right. So back in the day, when the U.S. didn't have as much capital invested per worker as Great Britain did or whatever, yeah, the way the Americans would have competed is they wouldn't have earned as high wages as British workers. And then over time, as they industrialized, they would have. But putting all that aside, okay, so the idea is we need to, that it would take a while, like operating at a loss, to get our factories up and running, and only 20 years down the road, let's say, because again, it's always a quote infant industries argument. And so the idea is, oh, we just need to have these tariff barriers in place just to let our manufacturing base get up and running. And then, hey, we're Americans. We can compete with anybody if it's a level playing field. And then we'll, take the training wheels off and we'll go head to head with those Brits and we'll crush them. Right. That's kind of the argument. And I'm saying, so if that's true, then okay, you don't need a tariff barrier. You could operate the factories at a loss for the early years until the point at which you could compete. And you could say, oh, well, capitalists couldn't do that. But again, the time it takes to build an apartment building, you're not making money, right? So in general, the market economy, firms are certainly able to invest things in order to reap a profit down the road. And so with these examples, it always comes back to people in Washington are really farsighted and they can see something that obviously makes economic sense. And it's just those stupid capitalists that can't see it.
Right.
And typically it's because, no, if the capitalists don't want to do it, it's because it actually doesn't make economic sense. And that Washington is just forcing it to happen sooner than it otherwise would. So So I can, if it is the case that private business would not have developed U.S. manufacturing capacity as rapidly as actually happened in practice, then I would say that meant it wasn't economically efficient, right? It's not whatever, the state of planet Earth was in the year 1795. It's not that there should have been everybody rushing to build factories all over the place, that it made sense, given the limited amount of capital that humans had at their disposal, to do it sequentially, this place, then this place, then this place. And so if U.S. government imposed tariffs, made factories develop faster than everybody admits would have happened in a total, laissez-faire economy, then I would say that's showing they shouldn't have done it. Just like it was stupid to send something to the moon. We'll remain agnostic as to whether anyone actually jumped on it in the 60s, right? Like in other words, when the pro-Kennedy people can say in NASA, oh, Bob, private business it wouldn't have been profitable to send something to the moon in the 60s if it was just privately funded. And say, right, and that's why they shouldn't have done it. That was crazy. That was a humongous waste of humongous.
Humongous.
I made tremendous and humongous into one word. I think I'm like a Dickens character or something. Waste of resources. Okay, so same thing here. Everyone just takes it for granted that, oh yeah, we should have developed our manufacturing base. And so why? That doesn't, if it's so obvious that should have happened, then it would have happened. And if like I say, again, it's not enough just to say, oh, well, we know that this is something that would have been profitable in 15 years, but business is only willing to look 3 years in the future. I mean, that's what I'm saying. In general, especially guys like Vivek know how that's not the case, that people in Washington are better at investment and so on. The point is because they don't suffer the costs. It's, again, like another example, like building a sports stadium or something. And if people want to say, oh, no, without the government business partnership, that stadium wouldn't have been built, to say, okay, then that means the stadium shouldn't have been built there.
I totally agree. And of course, it's usually not just Washington, quote unquote's idea to impose these tariffs or to give subsidies. It's some lobbyist who, want some crony favors. So would you say that the argument I led this question off with is just something just made up out of whole cloth as a way to fool the public into just allowing this crony mechanism to go forward? Or
do you mean, are the people lobbying for the tariff protection completely cynical, or do they actually think what they're doing helps the country?
I mean, I think they're cynical, yeah, but I guess what do you think? I mean, where did this argument come from if it doesn't make any sense? It seems to me like the political pressure was just, hey, help me, I got you elected, so put up this tariff or give me the subsidy.
Right.
And if you have to say you have to do it for the whole industry, great, just give me my stuff.
Well, what's interesting, I don't know like where the Hamilton, well, I think I probably do. So, all right, so there's two things. So one is if you had an existing industry and then an upstart competition, like the Detroit car companies, and then all of a sudden Japan starts competing with them and they, have their quality revolution and whatever, and they do all the stuff over there. That then the Detroit saying, whoa, we're losing market share here. And then they realize we can't compete with these guys. And then they go to Washington for protection to save American jobs. That makes sense to me. I mean, it's still wrong, but I can kind of see how if you had your thing, you had all these workers going there and it was a great job and everyone knew you could take care of your family and retire from Ford or whatever, doing that as a career. And then all of a sudden these Japanese are competing with, especially if they don't even look like us. Like I totally can see how that would just look crazy. And like, we're just going to sit by and let them destroy our country or hollow it out and, or lose our manufacturing capacity. Right. So I get how you would think you are doing the right thing by going to Washington and saying, this is crazy, we can't let this continue. Right. And just in general, I think people are very good, myself included, at doing things that benefit yourself financially, and then you can sleep at night though because you convince yourself that no, this is actually the right thing to do. Right. It just so happens that I benefit from it. Right. So I think there's that. As far as like the infant industries, I'm kind of making this up, but I think probably like Alexander Hamilton was a well-read guy and he traveled the world and everything, and he could see the advanced nations and thought, okay, we're not there yet. How do we get there? Let's leapfrog by doing these strategic policies, blah, 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 that will promote industry. And again, I just, he may have been earnest in what he was saying. But again, even there, the stuff kind of goes hand in hand. That if you think it's good, but then also, and this kind of benefits these guys that are my buddies, and it's win-win.
What do you know? Why does it always work out like that?
Yeah.
So okay, let's pivot to the national security argument, and in a way, they're close.
Mm-hmm.
Like if Detroit always lost to Japan or Germany or whatever, and to the point where we didn't have an auto industry at all, you could see where you might be a little nervous about that, and especially if it's not Detroit, but it's the people who make your tanks and your boats and your missiles and all of that. So what do we say about tariffs to protect national security?
Okay, so as far as like the actual military hardware, like, hey, who's programming the guidance computers for our cruise missiles and stuff like that? Yeah, I would think like the Pentagon, the procurement office would have criteria in there, including let's not buy from our direct enemies or people that we think might have an incentive to put some special, back doors into the system or whatever, that they can just flip a switch and all of our hardware stops working. Right. So that seems pretty obvious that you would do that. But that's not a tariff. That's just in terms of when they're buying the stuff that, they had those requirements in place. The analogy I used on a podcast episode was if the Secret Service is hiring, and they have the fitness exam and the aptitude test, and it turned out that the top 10 applicants were all from Iranian special forces, it'd probably be stupid to hire them. Okay, you guys are in charge of the president's security. Like, that seems like a bad idea. And say, hey, we're a meritocracy, and all these guys did the best on the test. And what do you So they're like, but you wouldn't put up a huge barrier to immigration to make sure, we're not going to hire a bunch of Iranian special forces for the Secret Service. So that's why we got to make it that nobody can immigrate in and take a job here. Right? That would be kind of overkill. So likewise, if you're talking about actual military hardware and you don't want to source that from potential adversaries, well, then, yeah, you can have that as a policy. But again, the way to get that result is just on the buying end, just to
Right.
have your requirements. But for stuff like, say, Vivek on that thing I saw recently where he was in Georgia talking to college kids, he brought up semiconductors. And he said right now the U.S. gets a lot of semiconductors from China, and that's very, essential for U.S. military hardware. And something like that, it's if everybody knows that if we went to war with China, they would just embargo us, and it would have to be an embargo. Like they would have to just stop exporting it, right? Because if they just stopped selling to us, but they sent it to everybody else, we would just buy it from those people. You know what I mean? They wouldn't be able to, so China would just have to stop exporting it. But let's say they would do that. Other people can see that coming. So at the very least, these things aren't like eggs, like you can store them. And so people could see that like, it's likely, and there's futures markets and stuff, right? So you could have experts with their own money on the line making bets as to because if China does shut off exports of those things, the market price, the global price shoots up. So there would be an incentive for people to stockpile them and then, sell into it once the price skyrocketed. So there's that element, but then even more beyond that, depending on the numbers, you could have factories that were like literally just mothballed, like waiting to be activated if and when that happened. Or they could be making other stuff while you're still importing the semiconductors. And then again, if China embargoes us, then you could switch over and the factories that were making the one thing could switch to making the semiconductors. All right. So my point is, without knowing the specifics about, well, how much cheaper is it to import them than to produce them domestically? Are we talking? And so if it's a kind of thing where, anyway, my point is the market has all kinds of ways you could deal with the possibility that if we went to war with China, they would stop giving us semiconductors. And that's the way to handle it, I think. And to just have a blanket, well, no, we're going to have a tariff on all Chinese goods. I mean, for one thing, that wouldn't even necessarily work. Right? Like if you wanted to start listing more specific sensitive items like semiconductor, whatever, and just had a tariff on those, I mean, for one thing, why wouldn't you just say no? You flat out can't import them, period. Right? Because what if you had the tariff, but the cost of production was still so different that we still imported everything from China, and then it was just a tax, and we didn't get the domestic manufacturing anyway. Right? So it seemed like if really what the issue is we cannot be reliant on China for semiconductors because of military security, than just have a law saying U.S. period can't import
Right.
semiconductors. That would do it. But don't have a broad-based tariff, because then if it's on everything, if semiconductors are really something where the Chinese have a comparative advantage, then a general tariff on Chinese imports might result in U.S. industry rearranging so it makes a lot of that stuff and we don't import it as much. But what if we still just import all of the semiconductors, because that thing is what the Chinese are really good at compared to us, right? So you see what I mean? Like it's just a really crude club to attack this problem, and in most cases, it's not even necessarily addressing what the ostensible issue is.
Yeah, you said a lot there, but what I really got out
Yes,
of
I
it
did.
is what I really got out of it is the tagline for this episode, which is clearly Dr. Bob Murphy says the thing about missiles is they're not like eggs.
Well, no, I said semiconductors
Were we back? Okay, maybe you did.
because
Yeah, well,
you can store them, you can stockpile them.
the
I mean, missiles too, but
in my mind, you were talking about missiles. You keep hitting the same points, which are good. We should sort of emphasize them, which is the dynamism of markets that adjust to situations on the ground. I mean, and it's not an inhuman thing. Markets, it's people adjusting to the new circumstances, and that's more powerful than any tariff. And also just the efficiency of free markets in deciding when and how and where to allocate resources. It's always going to be better than some ham-handed government policy like a tariff, which is usually going to be levied in a crony manner. As we were preparing to record this, and I knew we were going to talk about tariffs, I thought about the Great Depression a little bit because, the arguments for installing tariffs or using them is because our economy is in the doldrums, according to many, and they're not wrong. And where you and I might look to government regulations and horrible policy as the reason that our industries are having trouble, most people say we can just solve these things with a tariff. And so I was thinking back to the Smoot-Hawley tariff and how it deepened and widened the Great Depression. And I was wondering, I'm sure you've studied that more than I have, which was 5 minutes on Wikipedia. So would you say the situations are in any way analogous then and now? And just what do you think was the closest direct result of the Smoot-Hawley tariff on the Great Depression?
Okay, great. So it was enacted in 1930, and it was big. So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I did have a section on it in my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression, New Deal, but off the top of my head, I don't remember. But so in other words, I'm saying it's not a straw man that today's free traders talk about. Oh, well, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. You know what I mean? Like it was a big deal at the time. So I don't think, in terms of, if you ask me, or put it this way, when I have been doing, like when I used to do radio hits when my book came out on the Great Depression, I don't think I ever brought up the Smoot-Hawley tariff. If somebody had asked me about it, I obviously would have talked about it. But in terms of when you say, hey, what caused the Great Depression? Was it the gold standard? Was it this? Was it that? Was it just wildcat, laissez-faire stock market bubble investing, and because they didn't have the SEC? I wouldn't pivot and bring up the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So to me, that was just something dumb. It was kind of like, I think they raised the minimum wage after the financial crisis hit. I think just in terms of the scheduled minimum wage hikes, one of them happened to hit right after that did. And so that certainly didn't help, but I don't think the financial crisis was caused by a minimum wage hike. And so likewise here, I think the stock market was blown up in the 20s because of loose Federal Reserve policy, partly because they were trying to bail out the Bank of England. And then, once that bubble burst in 29, you would have had a downturn, a crash. And if they had just let the system find its bottom the way previous government, administrations had, it would have just been bad for a year or two. But they didn't do that. Hoover came in, had up till that point the most interventionist during peacetime administration in U.S. history. And in particular, the thing he really did that was bad is he got big businesses and labor unions to agree not to let wage rates fall. And so right when you had, and there were like bank runs and such, right? So like there was a sense in which the money supply shrank by like a third. So prices were collapsing, and in conjunction with that, wage rates weren't allowed to fall.
Yeah.
And so that made labor artificially more expensive, which is why unemployment went up 25%. So in the midst of all that, yes, in 1930 they also enacted this big, huge jack up in tariff rates, which just added insult to injury. But I don't think that was like the precipitating cause. Somebody who did, he made an interesting argument. I think it was Jude Winniski argued that if you looked at, I guess it would be in 1929 when the Congress was debating the Smoot-Hawley bill, and depending on how it was going, you could see the stock market reflecting that. So, right? Because in terms of the timeline, somebody might say, well, how could something that was put into place in 1930 have caused the stock market to crash in 29? But Winniski was arguing it was because people were rational and looking ahead. And realizing, they're putting in place something that's really going to suck in a year, and so that's going to affect markets today, and then that caused the crash. So I haven't studied it empirically to say whether that's a plausible, but I do know he made that argument. But again, as an Austrian, I think no, there was an unsustainable boom that was put into place, and that there was going to be a crash, and the timing may have been due to specific things like the Fed tightening and people and investors anticipating the Smoot-Hawley tariff, who knows? But to me, the big thing was, the unsustainable boom caused by the easy credit policy of the 20s.
No, I agree. My argument, or I think it exacerbated the problem. Wikipedia, the great fount of all human knowledge, says that it restricted total U.S. import and export by 67% while it was in effect. Year after year, which seems like it'd be kind of a big deal.
There was something, I remember getting into that. So I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I remember though at the time, like seeing figures like that and being concerned that it's hard to have a counterfactual, right? Because just in general, economic activity was collapsing. And so imports also would have fallen even in the absence of any change in tariff.
Yeah.
So when I've seen stuff like that, like I saw, I'm not saying the Wikipedia article, but it would be difficult in practice to tease those out. And I saw some people who really just wanted to wallop the Smoot-Hawley tariff saying, oh yeah, they passed this thing and then look what happened to international trade. And I was like, well, yeah, but it was the Great Depression.
It was going to be something. Yeah, exactly.
It was a global Great Depression. So yeah, trade between countries was going to fall off no matter what.
So my last tariff related question, and it's a good thing it's last one because we're at 51 minutes already.
We have been talking a lot.
We jibber jabber, the two of you and I and me. Boy, I'm tired. I've been traveling all day, people.
How many personalities you got in there?
You don't want to know.
Yeah.
On the plane, literally, I saw a post of yours on X, which was hilarious. I hope you remember it because I don't have it verbatim, but you're talking about how people support tariffs, saying that one of the great things they do is they raise up wage rates for employees. And then, likewise, minimum wage laws, you must love those too, because they artificially raise up wage rates for employees.
Yeah. So the specific way I put it was, if you're arguing with somebody like an Orrin, I'm just picking him as an example. He's actually very nuanced, but a typical free trader making the case, oh yeah, but tariffs make things expensive for consumers. And so the pro tariff person who thinks this is just, arguing with the kindergartner will say, yeah, right. But the economy consists of producers and consumers, right? And so the tariff helps the producer side, right? If we just had everything made cheaply in China and just imported everything, yeah, prices are low, but then everyone gets thrown out of work. If China just makes everything, right? Like in their mind, they're doing a reductio ad absurdum.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just low price, wow, Walmart's got all these low prices, but no one can take advantage of them because no one has a job because all of our jobs got, outsourced to China. And so therefore, don't you see how, the futility and the bankruptcy of your position, Mr. Free Trader, right? So they say that. So I'm saying one way of explaining their stance is to say, yeah, tariffs are good because they help U.S. workers, U.S. producers, and sure, it makes things more expensive, but, it's a balancing act, that's the kind of thing. And so then I'm saying that, right, and notice the similarity between that and when a left-wing progressive wants to raise the minimum wage up to whatever, $30 an hour, and people freak out and say, do you know like how much more expensive fast food would be? And like, it's going to hurt poor consumer. and they say, oh no, or like how much business costs are going to go up if now you got to pay minimum wage workers $30 an hour, and they'll say, oh yeah, but now those workers will have more income to them buy the stuff. So you got to look at both sides. And I'm saying so that they kind of make similar rhetorical moves, and yet in general, it's right wing MAGA types who do the pro tariff stuff and think that the left wing progressives who want to jack up the minimum wage are idiots, and vice versa. And yet there's a certain similarity in the rhetorical style.
So I want to know if you have anything more in your big brain dome about tariffs, but I also was wondering, like, if you had Donald Trump's ear, and he's about to impose all these tariffs, would you try and talk him down by, playing him this episode or giving him the Cliff Notes, or would you try and say, hey, look, man, let's just cut to the chase. 100 years of Washington meddling that's what's made American manufacturing and whatever inefficient globally. Let's just fix all this by slashing these regulations and getting Americans productive again, because they're not being hobbled by this ridiculous progressive government that you and I both hate, Donnie.
Right. So I would certainly, if I'm giving him my pure advice, and I think he might take it, that's certainly consistent with like a Rothbardian view of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good kind of thing, but also don't be a sellout. Hey, I got the ring of power, and now all of a sudden the world is my oyster. Yeah, I would just say, look, cut marginal income tax rates across the board. Try to cut spending. Look there's all these federal assets you could sell off and raise revenue that way. Like you don't need the extra revenue from the tariff. There's ways you could cut income taxes and not have higher deficits as a result from the other things you could do. To the extent, though, that he was like, no, I want to do tariffs, I would try to talk him into doing the strategic stuff and say, okay, go find like trading practices that you think that like the Chinese are doing, because it's, he wants to bash China. Say, okay, have your guys in consultation and I'll help you. We'll identify specific things that the Chinese government is doing that definitely, everybody would agree is a violation of laissez-faire. And then say the Chinese, we're going to have these temporary tariffs on your stuff until you do this, and then we'll reduce. You know what I mean? Like, give them a way that they can get out of it. Don't just make it a new thing. Like, from now, we're going to have tariffs like this until I look at how many manufacturing jobs we have and I decide, okay, that's good. Now we can lower the tariffs down the road. Like, no, make it a very specific, like, sort of, punitive thing that, that gets, like, you're putting them in the penalty box. Right. And it's not like that's the game from now. And like, no, you're just in the box for the penalty period. And then that, you know what I mean? So again, there's nothing purist and non-NAP violating that I just said. But my point is just, if we're being in the real world, and I think he's going to just start slapping tariffs on people, that I would at least try to, talk to him that way and say, oh, I did it this way. So you can still do the tariffs, show you're tough and whatever, but it's consistent with you're just doing it to try to get us to a more level playing field, because we all agree free trade's good, right? Okay. So
all right, well, unless you got anything else, I think that's probably a good spot to wrap.
I think I'm pretty good. I think we covered all the bases.
You're so happy with it that your voice went up 8 octaves all at once there.
I used to be a real jerk, but now I'm a people person.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're seeing this or listening to this, please go visit HeymanNature.substack.com, and also my Heyman Nature show at Heyman Nature on YouTube. Or please go see Bob Murphy at BobMurphyShow.com. And on Twitter /X. I'm starting to feel better about just calling it X now, Bob.
I am too.
I think Elon's finally got me. Maybe it's the Neuralink procedure that I submitted to.
Well, I can't believe how dumb I am. I didn't realize that was like he had X in all his stuff. Somehow everything. I just thought it was just out of nowhere.
Yeah.
He said, instead of calling it Twitter, I'm going to call it X. And I was like, well, that's stupid. And then I was
considering R and T, and I settled on X.
And then I was like, oh, there's SpaceX. There's okay. Yep. So there's that. Yeah.
So, on that little platform of his, I am at Rerazer, RERAZER. And what's your handle officially, Bob?
Bob Murphy Econ.
Very nice.
What's the Rerazer? Have we ever asked you that?
Very few people have. I picked that just sort of randomly I'm a poker player. And so we re-raise a lot, but I didn't want to spell it like that. I wanted to make it like I'm also leveling your chip stack or whatever. I'm raising it. So RERAZER. It's either brilliant or super, super lame, depending on your perspective.
Well, now I can remember it, because before it was just gibberish to me, so I couldn't even remember it. I was always typing Adam, and then some other Adam would come.
What is that goofy thing with a Z and an E?
Yeah,
that's what that's all about. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And as always, Bob, thank you. This was edifying.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Bye-bye.